They thought I was powerless, just another woman they could mock into silence. But that night, when my father-in-law spat out the word trash, and my husband ordered me to bow my head in shame, they forgot one thing quiet people often hold the loudest weapons. By morning, their empire would tremble, their fortune would evaporate like champagne bubbles, and they'd learn that the woman they dismissed as nothing had been everything all along. This is how I brought the Harrington dynasty to its knees with a single phone call at 2:30 a.m. My name is Clara Monroe, and I remember every detail of that night at Le Bernardin, Riverview's most exclusive restaurant, where my carefully constructed world finally shattered, or perhaps, where it finally began. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the private dining room, their light catching on Margaret's diamond necklace, Lydia's Cartier watch, and the contempt in Richard Harrington's steel-gray eyes. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table, my simple black dress a deliberate choice that still managed to offend my mother-in-law's sensibilities. She'd already commented twice about my quaint pearl earrings, a gift from my late mother that meant more to me than her entire jewelry collection. The quarterly projections for the Singapore expansion seem overly optimistic, I said quietly, studying the documents Richard had been boasting about for the past 20 minutes. The regulatory environment there has shifted significantly since your initial assessment. You might want to consider. The sound that escaped Richard's throat was somewhere between a laugh and a bark. He set down his whiskey tumbler with deliberate force, the amber liquid sloshing against imported crystal. Did you hear that, Daniel? Your wife thinks she understands international business. My husband shifted uncomfortably beside me, his hand reaching for his wine glass instead of mine. That small gesture told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. I've been analyzing financial markets for 15 years, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the familiar knot forming in my stomach. The Singapore Monetary Authority just announced new foreign investment restrictions last month that could— Trash. The word cut through the air like a blade. Richard leaned back in his chair, his custom Armani suit stretching across his broad shoulders as he gestured dismissively. That's what happens when you let trash into the family. Daniel. They start thinking they belong at tables where real business is discussed. The room fell silent. Margaret's lips curved into a satisfied smirk. Lydia actually giggled, covering her mouth with manicured fingers as if we were sharing some delightful joke. The waiter, hovering near the door, disappeared like smoke. I turned to Daniel, my husband of 3 years, the man who'd promised to stand by me against the world. His jaw clenched, but not in anger at his father. No, I recognized that expression. It was embarrassment. Embarrassment of me. Apologize, Clara. His voice was cold, controlled, each word measured and distant. Apologize to my father for overstepping, or leave. The words hung in the air between us, heavier than the silence that followed. I searched his face for any sign of the man who'd once told me he loved my intelligence, my independence, my strength. But that man had been slowly disappearing for months, replaced by this stranger who looked at me like I was an inconvenience, a mistake he needed to correct. Daniel, I said softly, giving him one last chance. Your father just called me. I heard what he said. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. And maybe if you showed proper respect, he wouldn't have to remind you of your place. Now apologize, or get out. I felt something break inside me then, but it wasn't my spirit. It was the last chain holding me to this toxic family, the final thread of hope that things might change. I stood slowly, smoothing my dress with steady hands, though my heart was racing at 100 beats per minute. You're right, I said, reaching for my purse. I don't belong here. Richard's satisfied grunt filled the space. Finally, some sense. I looked at each of them in turn, Richard with his arrogant sneer, Margaret with her vindictive pleasure, Lydia with her vapid amusement, and finally Daniel with his cowardly relief. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd finally broken the nobody from the South Side who dared to marry into their precious dynasty. "But you're wrong about one thing," I continued, my voice carrying a strength I didn't know I possessed. "I'm not trash, and soon, very soon, you'll realize that you don't belong here either." The confusion on their faces was almost worth the pain of the past 2 years. Almost. I walked out of that private dining room with my head high, past the sympathetic maitre d', through the marble lobby, and into the cool October night. My phone was already in my hand, Evelyn's number glowing on the screen. The Harringtons thought they knew who I was, Daniel's charity case. His mistake. His burden. They had no idea that Clara Monroe had been playing a much longer game, and at exactly 2:30, their education would begin. 6 months earlier, I stood in the Harrington family estate's foyer, still naive enough to believe love could conquer class differences. Daniel's hand rested on my lower back as he introduced me to his world, a world of marble floors, oil paintings worth more than houses, and people who measured worth in stock portfolios and country club memberships. "Mother, father, this is Clara," Daniel had said, his voice warm with affection that would later turn cold. "The woman I've been telling you about." Margaret Harrington's assessment was immediate and dismissive, her gaze traveling from my department store dress to my modest jewelry. "How interesting," she'd said, the word dripping with everything except interest. "And what is it that you do, dear?" "I'm a financial analyst," I'd replied, extending my hand. She looked at it for a moment before offering the limpest handshake I'd ever experienced. "For which firm?" Richard had asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't impress him. "Morrison and Associates. It's a boutique firm specializing in emerging markets." "Boutique," Lydia had repeated, exchanging a look with her mother. "That's a nice way of saying small, isn't it?" That first dinner set the pattern for every family gathering that followed. They'd probe my background with surgical precision, each question designed to highlight what I lacked. Where did I summer I didn't? Which sorority had I pledged none? Where had my family gone to school community college and state universities? "Clara's parents passed away when she was young," Daniel had explained once, trying to deflect their interrogation. "She's entirely self-made." "How tragic," Margaret had responded, though her tone suggested the real tragedy was her son's choice in partners. What they didn't know, what I'd carefully hidden behind shell companies and trust structures, was that being self-made had made me far wealthier than they assumed. For 8 years before meeting Daniel, I'd been quietly building Monroe Capital Holdings, starting with a small inheritance from my grandmother and my salary savings. I'd invested aggressively in tech startups and emerging markets. My boutique firm job was real, but it was also a cover for my true occupation running a private equity firm that now controlled assets worth $74 million. I'd kept it secret initially out of habit. Growing up poor teaches you to hide your advantages. Then, after seeing how the Harringtons treated anyone they deemed beneath them, I'd kept it secret strategically. I wanted Daniel to love me for myself, not my portfolio. How foolish that seemed now. Every slight, every insult, every moment of condescension, I absorbed them all, thinking my patience would eventually pay off. When Margaret forgot to set a place for me at Thanksgiving, I said nothing. When Richard referred to our engagement as Daniel's little rebellion, I smiled and stayed quiet. When Lydia introduced me to her friends as Daniel's current project, I pretended not to hear. But I wasn't just enduring. I was observing, learning, documenting. I studied their business dealings during these dinners, memorizing every boastful revelation about Harrington Industries' structure. Richard, drunk on his own importance and whiskey, would reveal more than he should about their leveraged positions, their debt structures, their vulnerable partnerships. "The key to maintaining power," he'd lectured one evening, gesturing with his cigar, "is ensuring everyone owes you something. Debt is control." I'd nodded along, the dutiful daughter-in-law to be, while mentally filing away the information. Harrington Industries was over-leveraged, dependent on specific credit lines from 3 major banks. Their real estate portfolio was heavily mortgaged, using variable-rate loans that could be called in under certain conditions. The company itself was vulnerable to hostile takeover if someone acquired just 32% of shares, the rest being too dispersed among distant family members who'd sell to the highest bidder. "You're too quiet, Clara," Margaret had observed at our engagement party. "In our world, you need to learn to assert yourself." "I'm just listening," I'd replied, "learning." She'd laughed, that crystalline sound that meant nothing good. "Some people can study all they want, dear. Breeding can't be taught." Daniel had stood right there, champagne glass in hand, and said nothing. That's when I'd started making real plans. Not revenge, not yet just protection. I began restructuring Monroe Capital, creating acquisition vehicles, establishing credit facilities. If the Harringtons ever discovered my secret, I wanted to be ready. But as the months passed and their cruelty intensified, protection evolved into something else. The last family dinner before that night at Le Bernardin, Richard had been particularly vicious. "Daniel, when you come to your senses and find a suitable wife, make sure she understands our standards. This experiment of yours has gone on long enough." I'd watched my husband, the man who'd once promised we'd build our own dynasty together, nod slowly in agreement. That's when I knew. The Harringtons would never accept me, and Daniel would never defend me. So I stopped trying to earn their respect and started planning to take everything they'd never thought I could touch. The signs of their contempt were everywhere, displayed as casually as their wealth. At Lydia's 28th birthday party at the Riverside Country Club, I arrived in a cocktail dress I'd thought elegant until Margaret's friends surrounded me like vultures circling something dead. "Daniel's wife," one of them had said, not bothering with my name. "How brave of you to wear something so accessible." The seating arrangement told its own story. The main table held 20 family, close friends, business associates who mattered. I was placed at a side table with the catering manager's assistant who'd been invited last minute to even out numbers, and Richard's driver who was only there to be available for the ride home. When I tried to move closer to Daniel, Margaret intercepted me with a smile sharp as winter. "Oh dear, we can't upset the seating chart. You understand." Daniel was 3 feet away, laughing at something Lydia's friend Charlotte was saying. He didn't even notice I'd been exiled. The country club became my weekly education in humiliation. Every Sunday, the Harringtons held court at their reserved table overlooking the golf course. I'd sit through brunches where conversations flowed around me like I was furniture, invisible until someone needed something to mock. "Clara, darling," Margaret announced one afternoon to her circle of friends, each woman draped in designer clothing that cost more than most people's cars. "Clara here is Daniel's charity case. Isn't it wonderful how he's giving back to the community?" The laughter that followed tasted like acid in my throat. I excused myself to the restroom and stood in a stall, hands shaking with rage. Not tears. In the mirror, I saw someone I barely recognized, someone trying so hard to fit into a world that would never accept her that she'd lost herself entirely. But I also saw something else. Purpose. I started a notebook that day. Not a diary, a ledger. Every slight, every insult, every moment of deliberate cruelty. Times, dates, witnesses. Margaret's comment about my deceased parents being fortunate not to see what their daughter had to do to climb the social ladder. Richard's joke about keeping the silverware count after I left. Lydia's Instagram post from a family vacation to Martha's Vineyard with the caption, "Family only, thank God," while I'd been told there wasn't room for me. The patterns emerged quickly. They were systematic in their cruelty, coordinated in their attacks. This wasn't just snobbery, it was a campaign to break me, to make me leave, to prove to Daniel that I didn't belong. At the Harrington Industries annual gala, I watched Richard work the room, his booming voice carrying over the orchestra. "My son's still sowing his wild oats," he told a Japanese investor, while I stood within earshot. "We all make mistakes in our 30s. The important thing is correcting them before any permanent damage is done." The investor's eyes had flickered to me, understanding immediately who Richard considered the mistake. But that night, I also overheard something useful. Richard, drunk on success and aged scotch, bragging to his inner circle about a leveraged buyout that had left Harrington Industries temporarily vulnerable. "We're exposed for the next 8 months," he'd admitted. "But after the Singapore deal closes, we'll be untouchable." 8 months. I had a timeline. The next morning, I called Evelyn from my car, parked outside a coffee shop miles from anywhere the Harringtons would frequent. "I need you to start positioning our shell companies," I'd told her, quietly, nothing that would trigger SEC notifications. "Clara, what are you planning?" "Insurance." I'd lied. We both knew it was more than that. Evelyn had been with me since the beginning, the only person who knew the full extent of Monroe Capital's holdings. A brilliant lawyer who'd been blackballed from white shoe firms for refusing to play politics. She understood what it meant to be underestimated. The Harringtons she'd guessed, Daniel's family. "They think I'm nothing," I'd said, watching Riverview's elite pass by the coffee shop window. "Let them." The most painful moments came at home, in private, when Daniel would echo his family's sentiments in subtler ways. "You don't need to contribute to conversations about business," he'd say. "It's not your world." Or, "Maybe if you tried harder to fit in with Mother's friends." Or the worst, "I'm defending you constantly. The least you could do is not make it so difficult." I started sleeping in the guest room, claiming insomnia. Really, I was up until 3 or 4 a.m., moving money, researching Harrington Industries' vulnerabilities, building what would become their downfall. They thought I was broken, defeated, wrestling with my inadequacy. I was wrestling with something far more dangerous, the temptation to destroy them before I was fully ready. At Richard's 65th birthday party, 2 weeks before that final dinner, he'd raised a toast to his family. "To the Harrington legacy," he'd declared. "May it remain untainted for generations." His eyes had found mine across the room, the message clear. I'd raised my water glass in response, thinking of the acquisition documents hidden in my apartment safe, the credit default swaps I'd been quietly accumulating, the alliances I'd formed with Harrington Industries competitors. "To the Harrington legacy," I'd whispered, too quiet for anyone to hear. "May it get exactly what it deserves." The death of our marriage happened in increments, each day Daniel choosing his family over his wife, until there was nothing left but the legal document binding us together. I tried to find the man I'd fallen in love with, but he'd been replaced by a stranger who wore his face. "We need to talk," I'd said one evening, finding him in his study, surrounded by Harrington Industries reports. The lamp cast shadows across his features, making him look older, harder. "About what?" He didn't look up from his laptop. "About your mother telling the garden club that I trapped you with a fake pregnancy scare." His fingers paused on the keyboard for just a moment. "She didn't mean it that way." "Then what way did she mean it, Daniel?" He finally looked at me, and the exhaustion in his eyes was real. But it wasn't exhaustion from defending me. It was exhaustion from having to deal with me at all. "Clara, you're too sensitive. Mother comes from a different generation. She doesn't mean half of what she says." "And your father, does he not mean it when he introduces me as Daniel's current situation instead of his wife?" Daniel stood, moving to the window that overlooked the lake. We'd chosen this house together, back when we were a team. Now it felt like I was a guest in his life, tolerated but not welcomed. "Just smile and don't speak too much," he said quietly. "Is that so hard you don't understand our world, Clara? The dynamics, the expectations, the cruelty," I interrupted. "The classism. The way you all treat anyone without a trust fund like they're subhuman." He turned then, and for a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Shame, maybe, or recognition, but it was quickly replaced by irritation. "This is who we are, who I am. I thought you knew that when you married me. I married a man who said he wanted to be different from his family, who promised we'd build something new together. That was before. He stopped himself, but I knew how that sentence ended. Before he realized how poorly I fit, before his family made him choose, before he remembered who he really was. Before what, Daniel? Before I realized some things can't be changed. You can't make a... He caught himself again, but the damage was done. Say it, I challenged. You can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. Is that what your mother told you? His silence was confirmation enough. The Harrington Industries Gala was 3 weeks later, and I made one last attempt to salvage something. I wore a designer gown I'd bought myself, had my hair professionally styled, even practiced small talk in the mirror. When we arrived, I took Daniel's arm, determined to be the perfect corporate wife. For an hour, it almost worked. I navigated conversations about vacation homes and investment portfolios, smiled at the right moments, deflected personal questions with practiced ease. Then Charlotte Pemberton, Lydia's best friend and Daniel's ex-girlfriend, arrived. Daniel. She air-kissed him on both cheeks while I stood there like an accessory. You look wonderful. Stress must agree with you. They laughed at the inside joke I wasn't part of. Charlotte turned to me with false sweetness. Clara, how brave of you to come. Everyone's been talking about that little incident at the club last week. There had been no incident. This was a classic Harrington tactic reference, something that didn't happen, and watch me scramble to defend myself against shadows. I'm not sure what you mean, I said carefully. Oh, you know, she waved her champagne flute vaguely. The misunderstanding with the staff. But don't worry, everyone knows you're still adjusting. I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to correct her, to defend me, to do anything. He was studying his whiskey with intense focus. There was no misunderstanding, I said clearly. Charlotte's smile widened. Of course not. Daniel, remember when we attended this gala in 2015? Your father gave that incredible speech about maintaining standards. They reminisced while I stood between them, invisible again. When someone called Charlotte away, Daniel finally spoke. You could have just let it go. Let what go, the lie she just told. It's just talk. Clara, if you didn't react to everything, if I was someone else, you mean, if I was Charlotte? He didn't deny it. Charlotte understands how things work. Because she was born into it. Because she doesn't fight everything. His voice dropped lower, harder. Do you know how exhausting it is, every event, every dinner, every gathering I'm waiting for you to say the wrong thing, wear the wrong thing, embarrass me somehow. The words hit like physical blows. Embarrass you. That's not what I... Yes, it is. I set down my untouched champagne. That's exactly what you meant. I embarrass you. Clara. I need some air. I walked out onto the terrace, the Chicago skyline glittering below. Inside, through the windows, I could see Daniel already back in conversation, laughing, relaxed now that I was gone. Charlotte had returned to his side, her hand on his arm, and they looked like what his family wanted a matched set, a proper couple, the right people in the right place. That's when I knew with absolute certainty Daniel would never choose me. He'd already chosen, had probably chosen long ago. He was just too cowardly to end it himself, hoping instead that his family's cruelty would drive me away. I thought about leaving that night, packing my things, filing for divorce, walking away with my dignity and my secret fortune intact. But then I saw Richard hold court near the bar, boasting about a deal that had crushed a smaller competitor. Business is war, he declared, and in war, you destroy your enemies completely. I went home alone that night. Daniel stayed to network. He said, in my home office. I pulled out the Harrington Industries files I'd been collecting. The pieces were all there, waiting to be assembled. All I needed was the right moment, the final push that would transform my patience into action. I didn't have to wait long. The private dining room at Le Bernardin had been Richard's choice, a power play disguised as generosity. Only the best for family discussions, he'd said when his secretary called to inform me of the mandatory dinner. The word family dripped with irony, considering I'd never been treated as such. I arrived at 7:45 p.m., 15 minutes early, wanting to choose my seat and compose myself. The maitre d' recognized me with sympathy in his eyes. He'd witnessed enough Harrington dinners to know what was coming. "Mrs. Harrington," he said quietly. "Would you like me to—" "Monroe," I corrected. "I've always been Ms. Monroe. And no, thank you. I'll be fine." The room was opulent in that understated way only real money could achieve. Original Monet sketches on the walls, a chandelier from a Venetian palace, a table that once belonged to a Vanderbilt. Every piece whispered the same message: you don't belong here. They arrived together, a united front. Richard in his signature charcoal suit, Margaret in Saint Laurent, Lydia in something trendy and expensive, and Daniel, my husband, looked through me as if I were glass. "Clara," Richard said, taking the head of the table without hesitation. "Good of you to come." As if I'd had a choice. The invitation had been a summons, delivered with the threat implicit appear, or things would get worse. Margaret studied my simple black dress with undisguised disdain. "Interesting choice for dinner at Le Bernardin. Did you not receive the dress code reminder?" "I did." I kept my voice level. "This dress is perfectly appropriate." "If you say so, dear." She turned to Lydia. "Remember when we brought Charlotte here, she wore that stunning Versace." Always Charlotte, the ghost at every meal, the standard I'd never meet. Richard ordered for the table without consulting anyone another power play. The wine arrived, a Chateau Margaux that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He made a show of tasting it, approving it, then launching into his real purpose. "Harrington Industries is entering a critical phase," he announced, pulling out documents. "The Singapore expansion will transform us from a national player to an international force. The government contracts alone will generate $200 million in revenue." He spread the papers across the table like a general planning invasion. I recognized the proposal's flawed strategies built on outdated data and wishful thinking, the kind of plan that looked impressive to people who didn't understand the details. "The regulatory environment has changed," I said quietly, the words escaping before I could stop them. "The Monetary Authority of Singapore issued new guidelines last month that would classify Harrington Industries as a significant financial institution. The compliance costs alone would—" The sound Richard made was pure contempt. He set down his whiskey tumbler with deliberate force, the crystal ringing against mahogany. "Did you hear that? Daniel, your wife, thinks she understands international business." His voice carried across the room, designed to humiliate. "This is what happens when you let trash into the family. They start thinking they belong at tables where real business is discussed." The word hung in the air. Trash. Not even the pretense of civility anymore. Margaret's lips curved into a satisfied smile. Lydia actually giggled, her hand flying to her mouth in mock surprise. The waiter, a young man who'd been approaching with our appetizers, retreated silently. I turned to Daniel, my last hope. Surely this would be too much. Surely this would be the moment he remembered his vows, his promises, his supposed love for me. His jaw clenched, but not in anger at his father. I knew that look: embarrassment, irritation, the expression of a man who wished he were anywhere else, with anyone else. "Apologize, Clara." His voice was winter cold, each word measured and distant. "Apologize to my father for overstepping, or leave." I stared at him, this stranger wearing my husband's face. "Daniel, your father just called me." I heard what he said. He still wouldn't meet my eyes, focusing instead on the wine glass he turned between his fingers. "And maybe if you showed proper respect, if you knew your place, he wouldn't have to remind you of it. Now apologize, or get out." The silence that followed was complete. Even the ambient restaurant noise seemed to fade. This was the moment they'd been building toward for 2 years, the final humiliation, the killing blow that would send me running. Margaret leaned forward slightly, anticipation bright in her eyes. Lydia had her phone partially out, probably ready to text Charlotte the moment I broke. Richard sat back, satisfied, already savoring his victory. And Daniel. Daniel just looked tired. Tired of me. Tired of the conflict I represented. Tired of having to choose between his family and his wife. He'd made his choice long ago. He just wanted me to accept it. I stood slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled. My hands didn't shake as I reached for my purse. My voice didn't waver as I spoke. "You're right," I said, looking at each of them in turn. "I don't belong here." Richard's grunt of satisfaction filled the space. "Finally, some sense. Daniel, after she's gone, we can discuss." "But you're wrong about one thing." I cut him off, something I'd never done before. "I'm not trash, and soon, very soon, you'll realize that you don't belong here either." Confusion flickered across Richard's face. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that everyone has debts to pay." "Richard, you taught me that. Debt is control. Remember." I smiled, the expression feeling foreign on my face. "I've been an excellent student." Margaret's voice sharpened. "Are you threatening us?" "No," I said, turning toward the door. "Threats are for people who might not follow through." Daniel finally spoke. "Clara, what are you talking about?" I paused at the door, looking back at the man I'd once loved enough to ignore every red flag, every warning sign, every moment of doubt. Ask your father about the Singapore regulatory changes. Ask him about the leveraged buyout that left you exposed. Ask him about the variable rate loans on the real estate portfolio. I watched Richard's face pale slightly. Or don't. You'll understand soon enough. I walked out of that private dining room with my head high, past the sympathetic maitre d', through the marble lobby where other diners laughed and clinked glasses, oblivious to the war that had just been declared. Outside, the October night was crisp and clear. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing in freedom. Then I pulled out my phone. Evelyn answered on the second ring. "Clara, it's almost 9 p.m. Is everything?" "It's time," I said simply. "Tonight. Trigger everything." "Clara, are you sure once we start this?" "They called me trash. Evelyn, my husband told me to apologize for existing." I watched a couple pass by, holding hands, happy. "I'm done being patient." "Understood. I'll initiate the sequences. The overnight markets in Singapore open in 3 hours." "Perfect timing," I said, thinking of Richard's precious expansion plans. "And Evelyn, make sure the first notices arrive during their breakfast. I want them to choke on their coffee." I ended the call and walked to my car, leaving the Harrington family to their champagne and superiority. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd finally broken me. In approximately 6 hours, they'd learn exactly how wrong they were. My apartment had never felt more like a sanctuary than it did that night. The minimalist space on the 40th floor overlooked Lake Michigan, purchased with my own money, titled in my name alone, one of the few things the Harringtons couldn't touch. I poured myself a glass of wine, a modest Pinot Noir that I actually enjoyed, unlike the pretentious vintages Richard always selected. The city lights sparkled below as I walked to my home office, a room Daniel had never entered. He'd assumed it was where I did my little job work, never imagining the command center it actually was. 3 monitors, a wall of filing cabinets, and a safe that held the future destruction of the Harrington Empire. I set down the wine and opened the safe with steady hands. Inside lay 2 years of meticulous preparation contracts, financial statements, corporate structures, loan documents, and the crown jewel, a detailed map of every vulnerability in Harrington Industries' corporate structure, Richard's drunken boasts, Margaret's gossip, Lydia's careless social media posts, Daniel's forgotten laptops, they'd all contributed to this intelligence without knowing it. The clock read 10:15 p.m. In Singapore, the markets would open soon. In Chicago, the Harringtons were probably still at dinner, toasting my departure, planning their son's next marriage to someone suitable, someone like Charlotte. I spread the documents across my desk like tarot cards revealing fate. Each piece had been acquired legally, ethically, through public records and careful observation. Monroe Capital Holdings had spent 18 months quietly accumulating positions, preparing for a moment I'd hoped would never come. My phone buzzed. Evelyn. "I'm at the office," she said without preamble. "The team is assembled. Are you absolutely certain about this? Once we execute, there's no going back." I picked up a photo from my desk, my parents at their 25th anniversary, 2 weeks before the car accident that took them. They'd worked themselves to exhaustion building a small cleaning business, providing for me, believing their daughter could be anything. They'd died never seeing me graduate college, never knowing I'd turned their life insurance into the seed money for an empire. "The Harringtons called me trash tonight," I told Evelyn. "They think I'm nothing because my parents cleaned offices instead of owning them. They're about to learn that trash can be recycled into something far more valuable." "Understood. Walking you through the sequence now?" I heard her typing. "First wave. At 2:30 a.m. Chicago time, our Singapore subsidiary will file notice of default on Harrington Industries' bridge loan for the expansion. They missed a technical covenant regarding debt-to-equity ratios, something their lawyers should have caught but didn't. "Because they were too arrogant to read the fine print," I said, remembering Richard bragging about his legal team rubber-stamping everything. "Exactly. That triggers cross-default clauses in 4 other loan agreements. By 3 a.m., their primary lenders will be legally required to call in $600 million in debt." I pulled up the second monitor, showing real-time positions. "What about the real estate portfolio?" Phase 2. At 4 a.m. Shoreline Capital. That's our shell company exercises its option to purchase the Harrington Tower mortgage from First National. We'll own the note on their headquarters building. Variable rate adjusted to maximum legal levels. Payment due in full within 30 days. "And the stock manipulation?" I asked, though manipulation was too strong a word. Everything we were doing was perfectly legal, just ruthlessly strategic. "So Phase 3, at market open, the consortium we've assembled will begin selling Harrington Industries stock. Nothing illegal, just major shareholders deciding to exit positions simultaneously. We estimate a 40% drop by noon. The board will panic. And that's when Phase 4 kicks in. Monroe Capital Holdings emerges as a white knight, offering to buy the distressed assets at 30 cents on the dollar. By end of business day, you'll own controlling interest in Harrington Industries." I stood at the window, watching the city sleep, unaware of the corporate massacre about to unfold. What about their personal assets? "Margaret's trust fund is tied to Harrington Industries' stock value. She'll lose 80% overnight. Lydia's startup was funded by a company line of credit that's about to be frozen. Richard personally guaranteed several corporate loans. When those are called, his personal holdings become collateral." "And Daniel?" Evelyn paused. "His trust fund is structured differently. He'll keep about $2 million, enough to live on if he's careful." More than he deserved, but I wasn't completely heartless. Just mostly, at least tonight. "Execute everything as planned," I said, "but I want to make one call first." I dialed a number I knew by heart. James Morrison, my old boss at the boutique firm, answered despite the late hour. "Clara, is everything all right?" "James, remember when you told me I was too soft for this business, that I needed to learn to be ruthless?" He chuckled. "You proved me wrong long ago." "Why?" "I wanted to thank you, and to tell you that Harrington Industries will be under new management by tomorrow evening. If you have any positions, you might want to exit before market open." Silence. Then, "Clara, what have you done?" "What needed to be done. Good night, James." I hung up and called Evelyn back. "One more thing. I want the first default notice delivered to Richard's home at 6 a.m. during breakfast. Make sure it requires a signature." That's cruel, Clara. No, I said, thinking of every moment of humiliation, every public slight, every private cruelty. Cruel is calling someone trash at dinner. This is justice. At exactly 2:30, I sent the final email from my secure server. Execute all positions. Then I did something I hadn't done in 2 years of marriage. I slept peacefully, without pills, without wine, without the weight of trying to be someone I wasn't. On my nightstand, my phone buzzed with confirmations from Singapore, New York, London, the machinery of revenge grinding into motion while the Harringtons slept in their beds, secure in their superiority. By dawn, their empire would be rubble, and from my apartment high above the city, I would watch it burn. I woke at 5:30 to watch the sunrise paint Lake Michigan gold, coffee in hand, my phone displaying a cascade of notifications. Each ping was another domino falling in the carefully orchestrated collapse of the Harrington empire. The first call came at 6:12 a.m. Daniel. What did you do? His voice was raw, panicked. Clara, what the hell did you do? Good morning to you too, I said calmly, taking another sip of coffee. I assume Richard received the default notice. He's having chest pains. Mother's calling an ambulance. The lawyers are here. The accountant's Clara. This has to be a mistake. It's not a mistake. Your father taught me that debt is control. I'm simply applying his lesson. The Singapore loan. How did you even know about the covenant breach? Your father discussed it at dinner 3 months ago. He laughed about hiding it from the auditors. Remember, he was quite proud of his cleverness. Silence. Then, you've been planning this. Yes. For how long? Since the moment your family made it clear I would never be anything but trash to them. I heard commotion in the background, Margaret's shrill voice, Richard's booming demands for answers, Lydia crying. The sound was symphony to my ears. Clara, please, we can fix this. Come to the house. We'll talk. The time for talking ended last night when you told me to apologize for existing. I ended the call. By 7 a.m., the financial news networks had picked up the story. Harrington Industries in crisis. The headlines screamed. Multiple loan defaults trigger corporate meltdown. Evelyn called with updates every hour. First National just froze all Harrington accounts. The board is holding an emergency meeting at 9. 3 major clients have already pulled their contracts. What about the stock? Down 28% in pre-market trading. It'll get worse when the market officially opens. At 8:45 a.m., Margaret called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. You vindictive little bitch, she hissed without preamble. You've destroyed everything we've built. No, Margaret, you destroyed it the moment you decided I was beneath you. I'm just collecting the pieces. The country club, the charity boards, our reputation, do you understand what you've done? I understand perfectly. You're about to experience what it feels like to be unwelcome in your own world, to have people whisper about you, judge you, find you lacking. This is illegal. We'll sue you for... Everything I've done is perfectly legal. Your lawyers, the ones you can still afford, will confirm that. Richard's own carelessness created these vulnerabilities. I simply exploited them. She was crying now, ugly sobs that would have moved me once. The house. They're saying we could lose the house. The Harrington estate, their shrine to old money and older prejudices. Yes, you'll probably lose the house. But don't worry, Margaret. I'm sure you can find something more. Modest. Something more suited to your new circumstances. I'll destroy you for this. You already tried. And failed? By 10 a.m., Harrington Industries stock had dropped 43%. The board was in chaos. 2 members had already resigned. Richard, according to my sources, had been removed from the building by security after a screaming match with the interim CEO. Lydia posted desperately on Instagram, trying to maintain appearances, but the comments were brutal. The same social circles that had once courted her were now dissecting her family's downfall with barely concealed glee. The sharks smelled blood, and they were circling. At 11 a.m., my lawyer called. Monroe Capital's offer has been submitted to the board. Given the circumstances, they don't have much choice. Accept our terms or face complete liquidation. How long before they decide? Hours, maybe less. The creditors are threatening to force bankruptcy if they don't see a resolution by end of business day. Daniel arrived at my apartment at noon, using his key for the last time. He looked destroyed, unshaven, red-eyed, his usually perfect suit wrinkled, the golden boy reduced to tarnish. 70%, he said without greeting. You're taking 70% of my family's company. 73%, actually. Controlling interest with provisions preventing any family member from holding a position above entry level. He collapsed onto my couch, head in his hands. Why, Clara, if you had this kind of money, this kind of power, why did you stay? Why did you let us let them treat you that way? I sat across from him, maintaining distance. Because I loved you, because I believed you were different, because I thought patience and kindness would eventually matter more than pedigree. I'm sorry, he whispered. God, Clara, I'm so sorry. No, you're not. You're sorry you lost. You're sorry your family is ruined. But you're not sorry for how you treated me. Last night, you chose them. You always chose them. What was I supposed to do? Defend your wife. Love me more than you feared them. Be the man you pretended to be when we met. He looked up, tears streaming down his face. What happens now? Now you leave. The divorce papers will be filed Monday. I won't take your remaining trust fund, consider it severance for 3 years of marriage. But this apartment, this life, us, it's over. Clara, please. Your family wanted me gone. Congratulations. You got your wish. At 3 p.m., the board voted unanimously to accept Monroe Capital's acquisition offer. By 4 p.m., I owned Harrington Industries. The empire Richard had spent 40 years building now belonged to the woman he'd called trash. Charlotte called Daniel's phone while he was still in my apartment, packing his things. He put it on speaker without thinking. Daniel, I heard about everything. How horrible. But don't worry. Daddy says he can find you a position at his firm. Nothing fancy. Of course, but stable. We should have dinner to discuss it. Already circling, ready to pick at the corpse of his old life, Daniel turned off the phone without responding. By 5 p.m., the local news had picked up the story. Local dynasty falls in hostile takeover. They'd found an old photo from a charity gala, the Harringtons in all their glory, with me barely visible in the background. The symbolism was perfect. Richard had been hospitalized for stress-related chest pains, non-fatal. Unfortunately, but enough to keep him from fighting back immediately. Margaret was with him, her world reduced to a hospital room and whatever jewelry she could sell before the creditors claimed it. Lydia's startup investors had pulled out within hours of the news breaking. Her company was dead before it truly lived. Her influencer friends had already unfollowed her on social media, distancing themselves from the scandal. As the sun set over Chicago, painting the sky the color of old money burning, I stood at my window and felt empty. Not satisfied, not victorious, just empty. The revenge I'd planned so carefully, executed so perfectly, had left me hollow. Then I remembered my parents, their dreams for me, their belief that I could be anything. They hadn't raised me to be cruel, but they hadn't raised me to be a victim either. The Harringtons had built their empire on the backs of people like my parents, people they considered trash, disposable, beneath notice. Now that empire belonged to me. Tomorrow, I would begin rebuilding it into something better, but tonight, I would allow myself this moment of absolute victory. The Queen had taken the King. Checkmate. The boardroom at Harrington Industries. Now Monroe Industries commanded a view of the entire Chicago skyline. 3 weeks had passed since the acquisition, and I'd called my first official meeting as chairman and CEO. The same mahogany table where Richard had once plotted his deals now belonged to me. They filed in at precisely 9 a.m. Richard, Margaret, and Daniel. Lydia had refused to come, too humiliated to face me. They looked diminished, these titans who'd once ruled my world. Richard had lost 20 pounds, his custom suits hanging loose. Margaret's hands shook slightly, her wedding ring gone sold. I assumed, to pay for lawyers. Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes. "Sit," I said, gesturing to the chairs at the far end of the table, the seats usually reserved for junior associates. Richard's jaw clenched, but he sat. They all did. They had no choice. The legal summons had made that clear. "You asked for this meeting," Richard said, his voice a shadow of its former boom. "What do you want? Haven't you taken enough—" "I wanted you to understand something," I said, standing at the head of the table where Richard used to hold court. "This was never about money. I had money, more than you ever suspected." "Then why—" Margaret's voice cracked. "Why destroy us?" "Because you taught me to—" I pulled up a presentation on the screen behind me, photos from the past 2 years, me sitting alone at Lydia's birthday, the Thanksgiving where I ate in the kitchen, the charity gala where Margaret introduced me as the help. Every slight, every insult, every moment you tried to break me, you were teaching me exactly who you were, and more importantly, who I needed to become to survive you. You planned this all along." Richard slammed his fist on the table, a pale echo of his old authority. "No, you planned it for me the night you called me trash. I simply executed better than you ever could." I clicked to the next slide, Monroe Industries' new corporate structure. Effective immediately. Harrington Industries ceases to exist. Monroe Industries will honor all employee contracts, maintain all charitable commitments, and expand operations. The company your grandfather built will thrive. It just won't belong to you anymore. "This is our legacy," Margaret whispered. "Our name, our reputation." "Your legacy was cruelty disguised as class. Your reputation was built on crushing anyone you deemed beneath you." I moved to the window, looking out at the city. My parents cleaned buildings like this one, worked 18-hour days so I could have a chance at something better. You called that trash, but they had more dignity in their exhaustion than you ever had in your privilege. Daniel finally spoke. "Clara, please. We could have been happy if I'd accepted my place, if I'd smiled while your family degraded me, if I'd been grateful for the scraps of affection you threw my way when no one was watching." I turned to face him. "We could never have been happy. Daniel, you were too weak to love me properly, and I was too strong to accept anything less." "So what now?" Richard asked. "You humiliate us, and then what we grovel we beg." "No. You live with the consequences. Margaret, the charity boards have already rescinded your memberships. The country club voted yesterday you're no longer welcome. Lydia's been blacklisted from every PR firm in the city. And you, Richard," I smiled coldly, "you've been hired back to Harrington, Monroe Industries, as a junior analyst in the Singapore office, the same position you started at 40 years ago. Consider it poetic justice." "I won't—" "You will, because you have no other options. Your personal bankruptcy will be final next week. This job is the only income you'll have. Of course, you could decline. I hear McDonald's is hiring." The horror on his face was exquisite. "As for you, Daniel," I continued, "the divorce will be final tomorrow. You keep your remaining trust fund, as promised. Charlotte's father has offered you a position. Entry level, of course, but stable. I'm sure you two will be very happy together." "Clara—" "Ms. Monroe," I corrected. "Or Chairman Monroe, if we're being formal. We're not family anymore. We never really were." I pressed a button on the conference phone. "Security, please escort my guests out." As they stood to leave, broken and defeated, Richard turned back. Was it worth it becoming like us to destroy us? I didn't become like you, I said quietly. I became what you feared most, someone with the power to hold you accountable, someone you couldn't dismiss, couldn't ignore, couldn't throw away. Margaret paused at the door. We could have accepted you, if you just tried harder to fit in. No. I cut her off. You could have accepted me as I was. A woman who loved your son, who built her own success, who offered nothing but kindness until you taught me otherwise. You chose cruelty. Now live with the consequences. They left in silence, escorted by security guards who'd once jumped at Richard's commands. I watched from the window as they exited the building onto the street, looking lost in a world that no longer belonged to them. Evelyn entered as they left. The Singapore office is ready for Richard's arrival. 1-bedroom apartment, basic amenities. His supervisor is 25 years old. Perfect. Clara, are you okay? I considered the question. The hollow feeling from that first night had filled with something else, not satisfaction exactly, but completion. A circle closed. My parents would be proud, I said finally. Not of the revenge, but of the refusal to be diminished, of standing up, of proving that where you come from doesn't determine where you can go. What's next? I turned from the window, surveying my new empire. Now we build something better. Every employee gets equity, every janitor, every secretary, every person Richard would have called beneath notice. We're going to create a company where no one is treated like trash. That's the best revenge, Evelyn said softly. No, I corrected, thinking of Richard starting over at 65, of Margaret selling her jewelry, of Daniel realizing too late what he'd lost. The revenge is already complete. This is redemption. As the sun set over Chicago, painting the sky gold and crimson, I sat in Richard's former chair and felt the weight of victory. They'd tried to break me with their cruelty, their dismissal, their contempt. Instead, they'd forged me into something unbreakable. I was Clara Monroe. I was no one's trash. And I had won. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'm curious to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. If this story of revenge and redemption resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. What would you have done in Clara's position? I'd love to hear your perspective.